Welcome to In the Spotlight. I'm Abigail Pogrebin. Danielle Dardashti is an Emmy Award-winning documentary writer-producer, a former TV news reporter, and a Moth Story Slam champion. If you don't know what a slam is, that's hard to do, so look it up. She helps companies tell stories through film and audio and leads corporate storytelling workshops. And she worked on an incredible podcast we're going to talk about today with her sister, who is the next person I'm introducing now. Dr. Galeet Dardashti is a vocalist composer and an anthropologist who studies Sephardi Mizrahi Jews. In her new award-winning album, Monajat, she duets with recordings of her famed Iranian grandfather. She is currently a fellow at UPenn's Cat Center. Welcome to the sisters.
Thank you.
Producers,
Thank you so much.
podcast hosts, celebrities. You guys are, this podcast is like #1 Jewish podcast when we're talking. It's fantastic. I don't want to give it all away, but I want to have some sense of the premise for anyone who has missed it, which is a shanda. So who wants to explain? Who wants to start?
Well, we can both piggyback.
Okay.
But the podcast is called The Nightingale of Iran, and it tells the story of so many things, but our grandfather in Iran during the 1950s and 1960s was known as the Nightingale of Iran. He was one of the most famous singers of Persian classical music. He sang, he had a weekly spot on the radio. He sang at the Shah's palace. He sang at the most prestigious halls, and he was really beloved among Muslims in Iran.
His name was Yunus.
Yunus Dardashti.
And at the same time, our father, who was 19 years old at the time, was a teen idol in Iran and had a popular television show, a weekly show on TV where he was singing pop music. And Galeet and I have known about this all our lives, but it's always seemed kind of odd to us the way they left. There was not really an explanation
Left
of
Iran.
the way they left Iran, because life was really, really great there for them, and they left long before the Islamic Revolution. Our father left Iran in 1962, and the rest of his family left in the years following that. So we've always kind of wondered.
So there's sort of a mystery about why did it end so abruptly?
Yeah, why did they leave?
When they were so famous.
Did you know there was a mystery? I mean, before you start to unpack it, do you know there's this question mark?
Well, yeah. I mean, our dad is the kind of person who tells really amazing stories. And all of his stories are really positive. And
are they based in truth or are they embellished?
Well, there's the truth.
What is the truth?
Yeah, I mean,
especially in a family.
So it's his perspective. It's the truth.
It's
his
a truth.
Perspective. It's a truth. And so we've always wondered what other truths existed and what else,
what
went
was he
on.
not telling us?
Yes. And so when you say, was there always a mystery? I mean, there's always a little bit of mystery, in like when people tell those kind of wonderful, phenomenal, optimistic stories.
Right. So you knew there was sort of a gap somewhere.
Yes.
And before we just get to why he left or how you begin to figure this out, just so we really understand the fame of your grandfather, am I right? He was known as the maestro? Is that one of the terms?
Well, he was known as the Nightingale of Iran, and there's a term
Ostad.
Ostad that means something
master. It basically means he was a master of his art.
Master.
And what kind of a Jew was he?
He was a very religious, practicing Jew, which was very, unusual, because there are many stories of him being in, he was famous not among Jews, he was famous in the mainstream, and so there are many stories of him having to, not eat anything when he was in
the Shah's palace, or we're at a Muslim event where he's performing.
He kept kosher. They would have to boil an egg.
Bring him a boiled egg or something like that to eat.
But what about oppression of Jews? Like the things that we think about.
So it was
this
very
was a different
unusual
period.
time.
This was considered the golden age of
being
Jews.
a Persian.
In the 1950s and 1960s, when he was famous, was this kind of blip in history. that people don't realize existed. Our grandfather was, after he immigrated, actually, in the 1960s, he immigrated to Israel. He was still very famous in Iran, and he was flying back and forth between Israel and Iran
the flight from Tel Aviv to Tehran was a 2-hour flight.
Amazing.
And
up
it was
until
like
79.
he was commuting for work
Unimaginable.
from Israel to Iran. It was a different time when the Shah was in power before the 79 revolution. For Jews, life was really, really different than it was in any other time period in Iran. Our grandfather was born around 1899 in the Jewish ghetto in Tehran, in the Mahaleh, it was called.
It's a Jewish quarter.
And at the time, it was where Jews had to live because they were considered najes, impure, and had to live separated from Muslims. And Jews also were a tiny minority in the country, in Iran, like less than 0.25%, a tiny minority in Iran. And our grandfather, at 7 years old, became an orphan. Both of his parents died, and he had a very, very rough childhood.
Did he already have that talent? Was he already singing that young?
Yeah, his father taught him a lot musically. His father apparently also was musically talented and taught him to sing a little bit, but ultimately he and his siblings were separated, and he lived with an uncle who forbade him from singing, which is a very complicated story. So he had to kind of sing in secret.
So your parents, let's just get to them because there's more musical talent there. And particularly your dad, as you said, is like a teen idol, but also as a cantor. I mean, it seems like he knows cantorial.
So our father, which is, we tell quite a bit of this story is about him, but I'll just say that, our father, who is Iranian, eventually makes his way to the United States.
What age?
At 19. And
so when he left Iran, he came to the United States.
Yeah.
And
first met our mom in Israel on the way, which is another amazing story, which we tell in the podcast. But he came to the United States not planning to be a singer, which we explain in a very detailed way in the podcast. But eventually, he learns that there is a profession that one can pursue in the United States that is a cantor. In Iran, this is not a profession. If you are a great singer and you're a religious Jew that knows the prayers, you can lead services. And our grandfather did that as a volunteer. He did that for his community. And my father, when he came to the United States, he discovers this through a very interesting story, which we tell, and eventually finds his way to the Jewish Theological Seminary and studies to become an Ashkenazi cantor.
In Manhattan?
Yes.
So when does he meet your mom, who is not Ashkenazi, correct? Or
No,
she's Ashkenazi.
So he met our mom before he came to the United States. Our
Wow,
mother was,
that young.
Yes, our mother was 15 years old and in Israel with her family. We tell this whole story. It's
an amazing story.
Their love story is an amazing, miraculous story. How my mother, our mother's family ended up in Israel at this same event where my dad was singing in Israel when he was 19 years old is a whole story unto itself. How they all ended up in the same place at the same time. But he ended up meeting our mom and her whole family who were visiting from New York for the summer in Israel, and he was visiting for the summer in Israel from Iran on his way to America to go to college. And he kept in touch with the family and came to New York and saw them, and the rest is kind of history. Our parents, before they even dated, became a music duo, performing in the Catskills, in the Borscht Belt. And our dad was singing in Yiddish with our mom. And
so why eventually do you say we should do a podcast? Like, what makes you actually go to that medium?
Yeah, there are many reasons, but Danielle and I, during the pandemic, we had more time, and I had recorded this album where I was singing with my grandfather, which I just released in September.
It's wonderful.
Called Monajat. And Danielle is an amazing storyteller. And, you know, during the pandemic, I was doing a lot of events online, some of which she probably for the first time saw me do, and where I talk about...
She's a scholar of Middle Eastern Jewish stuff, but like I'd never seen her. It's funny because it's like during the pandemic we got to see certain aspects of each other's work, of each other's work in way. Yes, and it just sort of...
It happened.
It sort of happened.
Are you close, by the way?
Yeah.
Yeah,
we live 5 minutes from each other, but we had never done anything work-wise.
No. You never collaborate anything?
No.
Okay.
Like, we're very close as far as, like, with each other's children and husbands. Our husbands are close. As sisters.
And you have another sister, I should say, who's a rabbi.
And same. We're all very close, but not really work-wise. Maybe Galeet and Michelle a little bit more work-wise, because they both have worked in the Jewish world. I've worked in the media world.
Yeah.
And never really collaborated with either of them on
So during the pandemic, you're beginning to sort of get a sense of what each other does. And
and
how does that lead to your own story?
Well, okay, so I think I also, like during the pandemic, was like having all these like existential crises of like, our parents are getting older, we have to preserve their stories, like life is moving, time is moving too fast. What mark am I leaving on the planet? I mean, you know, it was like
it was an intense time.
Intense time. So between my existential crises and us having more time on our hands and us realizing that there was a way to collaborate.
And we have these really complementary skills that we were able to bring together. And it was kind of amazing. Once we started working together, we weren't sure what we were making at first, if we were making a documentary. We just started interviewing people. And because of the fact that Zoom became a thing that everyone knew how to do.
That's another
we were able to
calling relatives.
We were able to interview people on Zoom
all over the world.
Yeah.
All over the world. Wow.
You know, scholars and
people had
historians.
time. Also,
people had time. Yeah, and people were open to talking.
Yeah.
You know, and we had so many conversations and recorded the calls and didn't know exactly what we were doing with it. Started looking at our own, what we had footage-wise of our, and there's nothing video-wise from
nothing
then.
visual.
Nothing visual.
So it suddenly became clear
it
that
should be an audio.
And our grandfather was a radio star.
Right.
So it
perfect.
made sense as a podcast.
So the treasure trove, though, is in a Florida basement, right? Or in a New Rochelle basement.
New York, yeah.
Right. But your parents are in Florida part of the year.
So, yeah, our parents live in New Rochelle, New York, and part of the year, they're snowbirds. Every year they kind of spend longer and longer in Florida. So, yeah, it used to be like they were mostly in New Rochelle. Now it's kind of like getting to be that they're mostly in Florida. But yeah. And 2 winters ago, I think, or maybe last winter, I'm losing track of time, when we were in the thick of working on...
It was last year.
This was just last winter?
Yeah.
A year and a half ago. God, it feels like it was a million years ago. We were doing some work in our house, and my husband and I were staying in my parents' house while they were in Florida, while our kitchen was getting renovated. And so usually, you know, when you're in your parents' house, you're mostly in the kitchen, dining room, stuff like that. You're not hanging out in the basement of your parents' house usually. But when you live there and you're doing your laundry in the basement, you look around. And one day, I stumbled upon a gold mine of audio recordings because when our
big reels,
father,
ones that are from the 1960s, and Danielle,
preserved. Like they were obviously used. But I'm just saying they just were sitting there.
They were just sitting there. Because there's no way to play them. They're these big reel-to-reel audio tapes that nobody has the equipment anymore.
So what'd you do?
So Danielle calls me over and she's like, look what I found. Some of them were in
tapes.
Persian. We weren't exactly sure what they were. We talked to our dad, we get them digitized, and we realized what we had there, that our father was living in the United States, his family was in Iran, making long distance calls was a fortune. So what did they do? They recorded long conversations for each other in the United States, in New York, in Iran.
Not just conversations. They recorded like their entire Passover Seder in Tehran. They recorded Shabbat dinner in their home.
Kiddush.
So it's like sharing with each other various experiences, birthday parties for.
So they're almost like audio letters, but they're
Yes.
also
Totally.
Absolutely.
It's like nowadays how people leave like an audio memo,
Right.
like, these are like 3-hour
It's
audio
amazing.
diaries.
And because our family is a musical family,
there's a lot of music.
there's a lot of
of
music, a
singing.
lot of them singing for each other.
Incredible.
So we had this, suddenly we're hearing our parents singing together in their 20s and,
was
having
their reaction?
conversations.
What was their reaction?
Oh my God. I mean, it was just so exciting
And they
for
must
them.
have wept.
Yeah, I mean, they couldn't believe that they didn't even know that they had this in their basement. That was what was so
unbelievable.
funny. And for us and this podcast, it was
Well,
like
and
it was
it's-
like a time machine
It was.
to be able to go
the thing
back.
about it is, we're talking about like hundreds of hours of raw tape. So not everybody is as crazy as me to actually be able to like sit there and listen to logging. You know what it's like,
my
like
gosh.
logging hours.
Did you listen to it all?
Yeah. I mean, a lot of it was in Persian, and I don't speak Persian, but I got it translated. But I listened to it all anyway, because there were certain parts where somebody was crying or laughing, and I would put a star at that time code, like I really want to know what they're talking about here. Or I understand a little, and I could hear that he was telling them about the planning for their wedding or some really important parts. So I did listen to the whole thing before.
Where did you
I
do
got it
this?
translated.
Where do you sit and do this? Is this in your?
Part of the time, Danielle had COVID, and
So
she
I
was
was
just
isolating
upstairs.
on the 3rd floor of my house.
That's not necessarily a funny thing, Galeet.
No, but
She
it
was like living in Iran on the 3rd floor of her house.
like isolating.
Yeah.
People were bringing me meals to
Wow.
my apartment
And you were
in
just-
Tehran. Like I was like,
No, that was just
But I think part of the power when I was looking at is that how little you both knew about, in a way, your own heritage. I mean, in other words, it wasn't part of your upbringing
not at all.
that you
Not at all.
spoke the language, that
Not
it was
at
sort
all.
of a cultural vernacular.
No, not at all. And in fact, even so, the older our parents got, the more un-Persian, like our father. So even, our younger sister who's 10 years younger than us, like all of us, like he shed that. And now he's, as you'll hear in the podcast and people will hear in the podcast, he's sort of returning to some of it because of some of the work that we've done, the work that Galeet's been doing for 20 years, kind of reviving
And how about
our
for you
culture.
two? I mean, what has that journey been like?
Yeah, it's been very different for
very
Danielle
different.
versus
So
me
you
because,
start-
I'm an anthropologist and I've been writing about Middle Eastern Jews for over 20 something years. So I started this journey a while ago and started asking my father questions, when I was 30 years old and I was studying Mizrahim in Israel. I came back from my field work and I said, I want to learn how to chant Ta'amim. I wanted to learn how to chant from the Torah in Persian style. And so I started that and I, started singing, started studying Persian classical music. And so for me, this journey has been going on for a while, but it wasn't really like studying my grandfather, though it initially was going to be where I was going to study. Because I'm an anthropologist, I couldn't go to Iran. It wouldn't have been safe for me. So I ended up studying Israel. So I never went this deep as Danielle and I went together. But some of it, studying the culture, studying the singing, has been happening for me. So for Danielle, I would say it's been much more intense.
It's been
the
very
last
dramatic.
couple years, the last year in
And
particular.
before we get to you, I just want to touch on the fact that you said it would have been too dangerous, because some people don't realize that that's a given. I think you quote in some interview, "Over my dead body, you're going to go to Iran," your dad
That's
said.
what he said.
And so it just was impossible, correct?
Yeah,
Did you even consider it?
Yes, I definitely considered it even after my master's was done. I still considered it again going to Iran because I wanted so much. I mean, that.
And it was a different time than it is right now.
When
that time.
It seemed like there was this hope that Iran was going to go in this direction that it never went. It never went to. So that was very sad for me that I couldn't see the Iran of my father's childhood that he told us about. So, I switched gears and wrote about the journey of Jews coming from the Middle East and North Africa to Israel instead. So going really to Iran through some of these recordings was just so emotionally powerful.
And for you, was it, Danielle, you were kind of like...
For me, I grew up completely, we both grew up completely un-Persian, and my career had nothing to do with being Persian, unlike Galeet's. Yeah. So this was really kind of my first foray. I mean, when we started this project, I thought we were trying to find out about them, and about the past, and that we were doing a story about our grandfather and our father, and they're finding out about them. And I didn't realize how...
It was about us, too.
Yeah, this was a story about us. Really, I didn't when we first started the project.
And for those who haven't listened, can you just explain how the 6 parts work? Like, how did you kind of break them down? Is it just chronological?
No, it's not chronological. It's so it's a 6-episode series, and it kind of begins and ends with us. And in the middle goes through a bunch of different things, mostly chronologically, but also some of it is geographic, because there's a whole element of the story that takes place in America, and then there's a whole element of the story that takes place in Israel. And so some of it is
and before that, Iran.
And before that is Iran. So episodes 2 and 3 are mainly Iran. Episode 4 is America, and episode 5 is Israel. And then episode 6 is back to us.
Yeah.
And how much was on the cutting room floor? Like, how painful was that?
Oh, there was some. There was a lot of
it depends on what stage you're talking about, because there's the initial stage of you have hundreds and hundreds of hours of tape, and you have so many. We did like 85 interviews on Zoom, and then we had, so there's the initial stage of like, what is our story? Then you have the rough cuts that end up being like an hour long each, and then you cut them to like 35 minutes each. And that was painful.
Especially
also.
the last episode.
Yeah.
That was
we
hard.
had
Why?
I mean, it was just, what we originally had. I mean, there was so much that was good.
Yeah, there was so much that was good, but we had a really good team of story editors who were saying, this is all great, but if you take this part out, the whole thing is going to be even better. Yeah. And so some of those, like letting go of, we're like, what? We're cutting out Baltimore? It was like, Baltimore is not mentioned in our life. And it's, it was a nice part of the story, but it really wasn't contributing to the story that we were telling.
Well, the Jewish Journal, I think, said it's a masterclass in storytelling, music, and identity. So you should feel great about that. So I would love to just have you introduce so we can get a flavor for your grandfather's voice and talent. What are we going to listen to?
Yeah, we're going to listen to something that he recorded on the radio. And I don't remember exactly what he's singing in this clip, but as a singer of Persian classical music, what he did was he would take poetry, whether it was Rumi or Hafez, one of these Sufi poets, and he would improvise it. And that's what he's doing in this clip that he was singing on the radio in Iran.
Great, let's listen to it for a second.
هبا كلنا يشرون وعربا مسنا.
Amazing. And Danielle, can you also tell us, I'd love to hear your dad, just a clip of your dad. I know we can't see him singing a pop song from Iran, but what, in terms of the cantorial music?
Yeah, well, you know, our father never really sang Persian music in Iran. He sang international pop music. And then when he came to America, it's an interesting story how he became a chazan, a cantor. And
an Ashkenazi.
And eventually became an Ashkenazi cantor. And I think I say in the podcast, he didn't just become an Ashkenazi cantor. The line I say is, he became the best friggin' Ashkenazi chazan ever. So this is the...
Let's play a little bit of that. Amazing. So I guess finally, what do you hope people get from this podcast? And it's particularly in an October 7th landscape, where it feels to me that the fact that you took this deep dive and went back to family and story, and frankly, something that contradicts all the oversimplifications right now about what a Jew is. Can you just, each of you, reflect on that?
Yeah, there's so much. You know, one of the things that we're hoping that people will get from the podcast is, first of all, there are people all over the world and people of all different religions listening to this podcast. And it's amazing for people to realize that there are Jews coming from all different experiences and coming from all different lands, and that isn't obvious to everyone. And so it's the story of a very famous singer in Iran who was Jewish and was beloved among Muslims. And so to have people realize that the world was not always divided into, you know, Jewish and Muslim, that there was this period where they could live together peacefully and there was this shared culture. So that's one of the things that that we really hope people will get out of it. And there's so many more. Danielle, do you want to add?
And you know, and it hadn't always been that way. That's the thing. It's not like it was great and then now it's different. Things change. It had been very different for a long time, really difficult. And so I think the story, because of that, gives me hope that, you know, things can change, because our story shows a time that things were very different between Jews and Muslims in the Middle East and between Iran and Israel, and And I think also, a lot of people are getting different things out of our story. Like Galeet said, we are hearing from people all over the world who are writing to us to tell us their stories related to ours, from Jews and Iranians all over the world, and then not so much related in that sort of way, but about being an outsider or being an immigrant or finding their way. And it's really unbelievable to us how impactful this story has been for so many people. And I don't know, it's like we never really, we thought we were just preserving our own family story initially. And
You realize it has resonance way
Yeah.
beyond you.
way
Yeah.
beyond. I mean, when we look at, we have listeners in Iran
Writing to us,
It's amazing.
and
Jewish and non-Jewish.
and people that we're corresponding with in Iran.
Does anyone have like pieces of the story?
oh, well, people remember
Yeah.
our grandfather.
that's
I mean,
Yeah,
that's,
and there are new things that we're learning about the story that are incredible. And then there are new things we're learning that are not necessarily about the story, but are interesting about what's going on with Jews in Iran
Right
today.
now. Yeah.
And other things that of people that are reaching out to us because they want us to know their part of
Yeah.
Amazing.
this story. So, yeah.
Well, Danielle and Galeet, thank you so much for this wonderful podcast. It is called The Nightingale of Iran, and you can get it anywhere that podcasts are available. Am I right?
Yes, and I also want to mention one
Yeah.
other thing. Our website, nightingaleofiran.com. On the website, if anyone has trouble kind of figuring out how to access podcasts,
We've made
and
it very
we've made
easy.
it very easy
Thank
for
you for that.
You can go to nightingaleofiran.com, and at the top of the page, there's a button that says "Listen Here."
Fantastic.
And you can click that button to listen to the
Great.
podcast, and you can also join our mailing list
Oh,
and
perfect.
find out about all the events coming up and things like that.
Wonderful. I'm Abigail Pogrebin for In the Spotlight. Thank you for joining us, and I will see you next time.